Hey everyone, thanks for joining our Q3 Vercel partnerships. We were previously calling this the technical town halls, but we've rebranded to, I think, a better name here. But this is a session that we're having to cover the latest releases and updates that the Vercel team has made. We're also coming off, particularly right now, we're coming off the heels of Next.js Conf and Ship AI. So I'm going to be using this time primarily to talk about a number of the different features and enhancements that we've rolled out to Next.js, but also across the AI cloud, covering topics like Vercel Workflow and Vercel Agent, which are new products that I'm very excited to get in front of you all. So with that, let me go over a quick set of, or me introduce myself really fast. If you haven't met me, I know I've probably met many of you already, but I'm Alex. I lead up partner solutions at Vercel. I've been here for about 3 years, and I work with many of you, but primarily I work with solution partners as well as product partners on helping make sure that we're building great solutions for our joint customers. So whether that's diving into customer solutions myself or providing enablement sessions. And one of the awesome things that I get to do as part of this role is run these sessions and get the latest information to you. It's really hard to keep up with the web. It's also very hard to keep up with Vercel since we ship so fast. So I'm really trying to break down kind of the latest and greatest features all in one place, and then also give you an avenue to ask any questions on any of these products or solutions. So with that, we'll get things started here. For a quick agenda, this is what I'm going to cover. So I'm going to talk about Next.js 16. Probably no surprise there, given that we had Next.js Conf, but I'm going to talk specifically about some features that I think would be great for you to take a look at and consider adopting in production. And then I'm going to walk through Vercel Workflow, Vercel Agent, and the AI SDK, the latest products and enhancements that we've rolled out to these products from Ship AI. Each of these are fairly, I'd say, different in how you can leverage them, but all very useful for how you build and what you build on the web. And then outside of the Next.js Conf and Ship AI conferences, there's also been another or a set of updates that we've rolled out. So I'm going to cover some of the change log that we've had over the last month and a half or so, because I think there's some recent announcements that I think are valuable for you all and that I don't want you to miss. With any time, we'll have time for questions. But if you have any questions, feel free to go to the community chat and drop them there. All right, but first, I want to just say thanks to everyone for coming out to San Francisco for Next.js Conf and Ship AI, which is October 22nd and 23rd. I was there in person. I absolutely love going to these events. It's kind of like the biggest, it used to be the biggest day, but now it's the biggest days of the year for the Vercel team. It's fantastic. One, being able to connect with you all. Two, being able to see the newest announcements kind of go live. And for me personally, it's just awesome to connect with the developer community, the partner community, and just hear what you're building. Talk about the projects that you're building either with Next.js or with different AI products. And also hear perhaps some of the friction that you're having around either Vercel platform or Next.js overall, as that helps inform me on the material that I can get to you all, like sessions like this. So thanks again. But with that, let's just dive straight in to some of the technical content overview that we have from these conferences to talk about. So first, I'm going to talk about Next.js 16, which was this major release was announced at Next.js Conf. There's a slew of different features and updates here. I'm not going to touch on everything in a ton of detail. I hope to go at least a little bit deep on cache components if you haven't used them at all, so you kind of know kind of the reason why we've pushed out this enhancement and new pattern for building with Next. But then I'll also point you in the direction of how to use some of the other features here, like the DevTools MCP, TurboPack, how we're not rebranding, how we're renaming middleware to proxy, and then some of the other DX improvements like improved logging, as well as support for React compiler. But first and most deeply, I want to get into cache components. So cache components is this new pattern of building in Next.js, specifically with App Router. And it's really about providing explicit and flexible caching control. This is a new approach so that you have more control and more fine-grained control over rendering and caching. I say it's a new approach, but if you've used or have experimented at all with partial pre-rendering or use cache in prior versions of Next, a lot of the patterns here are going to be very familiar to those features. And in fact, cache components is generally available as is partial pre-rendering and use cache, which you can kind of see as like kind of under the umbrella of cache components. Um, that's why I include this diagram to the right. Again, if you've stayed kind of abreast of any of the partial pre-rendering features over the last couple of years, you've probably seen a diagram like this. The gist of partial pre-rendering and now with cache components is that we want you to be able to build a page and kind of like easily specify pockets of that page that can be dynamic. And that dynamic content can render within a static shell, which is served extremely quickly to the user, so performance should be great. But you're still able to put dynamic content in there very easily. Cache components, as I mentioned, is generally available, but it's opt-in, so you can upgrade to Next.js 16, take advantage of some of the other benefits, and then when you're ready, you could flag in to cache components and start leveraging it on your site. And then the last bullet on this slide that I'll note is something that I'm really excited about, which is with Next.js 16 or with cache components comes um, these new cache APIs, cache tag, revalidate tag. There's also an update tag. This is a new API that I think is awesome for being what I just say is like surgical to be able to surgically cache and revalidate exactly where you need to update content. I work a ton with different CMS products, and I have seen that it's sometimes very hard to revalidate your content given the complexity of your data and everything else. And this is a new API that I think is going to make this substantially easier. And I have an example and a repository that I'll link you all to as part of this presentation to get you started. So if you want to enable, again, it's generally available. It's opt-in. So what you'll just do is you'll upgrade to 16, and then your next config, if you just set the cache components flag to true, you'll then be taking advantage of cache components. There will probably be some extra steps that you have to do to make your application actually conform to the pattern of cache components, which I'll get into next. But I'm leaving this QR code up here. To the full set of documentation. Our docs are updated. It has a full set of examples as well as caveats to kind of be aware of. So if you are considering moving to cache components, or if you're just experimenting, of course, go to our docs and I'd say take a look through. But with that, I did want to walk through some of the changes or patterns that you should use when you do enable cache components. So there's going to be three different areas, generally speaking, that you'll need to watch out for and make sure that you are doing correctly when you enable cache components. And the first, and these are all kind of really around controlling rendering with cache components. When you opt in, you can basically think of cache components as kind of being enabled and then using partial pre-rendering as the default for all your pages. And partial pre-rendering is going to require that you use suspense in the right places so that it can actually render the static shell of your page while still enabling you to have dynamic content. So you're going to enable it. You may get some errors. It's totally expected. And what I'm going to cover here is basically where I think you'd spend the bulk of your time, perhaps refactoring or changing how you're doing some of your components to make it conform with this pattern. So the first here is around runtime data. So if you're using runtime data, APIs like cookies, headers, params, or search params, these are all things that can depend on the actual request, therefore can't be statically rendered ahead of time. So if you're using runtime data, you're going to want to wrap that component or that block of code that's doing that runtime logic in suspense. This is going to tell Next.js that the component or the components that you have within that boundary are dynamic, and therefore the rest of the page should be rendered statically as a static shell, which can be returned immediately to the user when they nav to the page. But then for those components within the suspense boundary, those will be streamed in when the data is, or when the runtime data is parsed, and then logic is done, and then the component is ready to render. So just one thing that I think you'll be probably keeping an eye on as you adopt cache components, again, if you're using the runtime APIs that I've included on the right side here. The next thing that you'll be looking for is where you're using dynamic data. So dynamic data here is what I'm referring to is anything that can change between requests. So this could be content that you're pulling, it could be personalization, a personalized version of a component for a specific user, and part of that component leverages data. This will be things like fetch requests, database queries, or if you just otherwise need to wait for the incoming request to do some work, you can use the connections API. So if you're doing these calls and you want it to be dynamic, i.e., like you want to, it could change between these requests. You will also need to wrap that in suspense. So if you have, for example, a page like this on the right hand side, we have this dynamic content component, which is doing some work of fetching posts from a CMS and then returning those. If you want that to be fresh for every single request, you would wrap that in suspense, and you could also specify a fallback skeleton there. And this again tells Next.js that the rest of the page can be static, served immediately to the user, and then for this chunk of the page will be dynamic. If you don't do this, and you have cache components enabled, Next.js is actually going to give you an error. You will see this uncached data was accessed outside of suspense. So this is a new error that you'll see when you flip on cache components if you're not conforming to this pattern that cache components really needs to have in order for partial pre-rendering to work appropriately. Where again, we're kind of prioritizing getting some HTML in a static form as quickly as possible to the user. And I should note, like, this example that I have here on the right is a very simplistic example. Like, we just have a page that has some dynamic content, but you're not restricted to just doing this on pages. You can do this, for within a header of your layout for something that needs to be personalized for that user, or perhaps dynamic based on their location. An example that I have coming up, we'll go through. We'll have some of those examples built in. So kind of alongside this, you might be thinking, "That's cool, Alex, but, like, I wanna actually cache that. I want that content to actually be part of my static shell. I don't need every single user that hits my post listing to see a dynamic view of my posts." They don't get updated that frequently. And that's great. We have that covered too. That's actually kind of the promise of cache components. So if you want to cache data and have that be included as part of your static shell that's rendered to the user, you'll be leaning on the use cache directive. Basically, any server component that you have, whether it's a page or a component, you can drop the use cache component in there or the use cache directive in there. And that's telling Next.js now that it shouldn't be dynamic. It should actually be included as part of that pre-rendered shell. Again, you can do this for pages, components. You can also do it for utility functions. So if you have like a get products function that just returns some data, you can just run use or have use cache in there, and then that JSON or whatever that object is that is returned will also be cached. Now, an important caveat, and there's more examples of and patterns of this in our document in our docs. If you're using a runtime API like cookies or headers, you can't co-locate that in the same component as use cache. As you might expect, use cache is making this kind of available to everyone as part of that pre-rendered shell. So if you're using a runtime API, which depends on the request, it's going to throw an error. So it's not that you can't cache anything based on that runtime data being a parameter. It's just you can't co-locate them in the same. So this will likely mean that you have to refactor some of your code if you have that currently in your code base. So these are really kind of like just touching the surface of some of the things that you should be doing with cache components. But again, linking to the docs, there's a ton more examples that I think are very helpful. Um, and in fact, this is a bit of a late heads up, but today we are having a Next.js 16 migration event where we're going to go through this in more detail, including cache components and partial pre-rendering. So if you're absolutely like, hey, I definitely want to adopt this, I want to see how to do this in more detail. What I said it is great, but if you want to go deeper, this is a fantastic thing or a fantastic event to register. So go ahead and scan this QR code or go to the Vercel.com event page and register there. All right. So that's kind of like cache components in a nutshell, but I wanted to give a really tangible example of what this can look like in practice. So I'm going to tab over to a demo that I have. And this demo that the Partner Solutions team has built, as you can see, is a kind of like a news media website that we built, the Platform Press. And this is, I was going to say, kind of like a mock news website, but for all intents and purposes, it's actually a functional website. Like all this content is actually coming from a CMS. We're using the patterns that I just outlined with cache components. And then we're also using the new cache API, which is really what I wanted to demonstrate here. But just to give a quick kind of glimpse of what this app is, and I'll be giving a link to the repo at the end of this, this is a new site. We have a hero component, as you can see. We're pulling in content. A lot of this is actually being cached and included as part of that static shell. So, for example, this hero component is being cached, but this community component is dynamic. It will render content depending on what the user has visited elsewhere. So I'll show you how that works in a second, but then the rest of this page uses cache components with use cache. So this page is very fast to load. It also includes a search page. So if you wanted to see how search was implemented here, you can absolutely do that. And if you go to a detail page, we implemented an example of how to do a kind of like subscription modal using middleware to kind of route the user to the right place. But don't worry, you can just click subscribe. You're not actually subscribing to anything. We just want to demonstrate the modal. You just have to click subscribe and you can see the full detail page. But as I called out, this kind of like this community component at the top is actually dynamic because when you are subscribed and come back to this page, after having viewed some other pages, you'll see that it's giving you kind of like a continue reading from where you last left off. Um, so in any case, this is the application and kind of like what it looks like. But how does this actually function with cache components? So I'm not going to go through every single little detail of how cache components works, but I want to specifically highlight how cache tags and revalidate tags are now a really powerful pattern for you to use for facilitating like live updates from the CMS to your application. So to demonstrate this, I want to call out that like looking at the site, you can see we have kind of like intermixed content in a couple different places. We have our articles, which is the most obvious, but we have these category tags. We have like change log as a category here. It's in the header. It's mentioned also again in latest news, as well as like at the change log here at the bottom. So if you were implementing revalidate on-demand revalidation with categories in the past, perhaps without this API, you might be using something like revalidate path, where a publish is done in a CMS. You have a webhook that calls this revalidate API in Next.js, and then revalidate path is called. And then you have to kind of just know the business logic of your app. Like if this type is published, I need to revalidate these pages, and you're kind of like hard coding a lot of that logic around and like kind of state of your app directly into the API. And it's not super agile or flexible with how you revalidate. And this creates a lot of headache, I think, for probably for marketers for the most part, because they just want to see their changes live, but also for developers because it's a lot to bake in. And this kind of, I won't say goes away with with the new caching API, but it gets a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tab over to the CMS that I'm using for this, which is Contentful. And I'm just going to filter this down to my categories. And I'm going to just change the changelog label from changelog to changelog updates. I'm going to publish this change. And it's not clear from this view, but there's already a webhook configured, which I'll show you the implementation for. And this is going to do a call to my next app. It's going to send me the relevant entity information around this category. And from that information, I can then revalidate. If I go back to my web application and refresh, depending on when the webhook actually gets called, you'll see that changelog updates now is now here in the hero section. It's updated in the header, and it's also updated all the other places where changelog was being mentioned. Now, again, if you were doing this kind of in the old way, this would be probably kind of painful to do. You're again like keeping in mind all the different like your entire sitemap, the structure of your pages. You're calling revalidate path, which admittedly would be a blunt tool to revalidate broadly across these pages. Like I don't need to revalidate everything on this page. I just need to revalidate the category header. And that's what the cache API is for. You can now, again, kind of like surgically just update what needs to be updated. And what this looks like in practice of the actual application is the code here. So what I'm looking at here is the code for the hero component here at the top. And this hero section does a couple things. It uses use cache. It's actually using use cache remote, which is a directive for basically using the Vercel data cache. So this now gets persisted to Vercel, so subsequent users gain performance benefits. I'm specifying a cache life as the absolute maximum because I'm using on-demand revalidation, which is great for performance. And then I do my actual content retrieval. So I'm calling get articles for the top article that's featured. I'm calling get articles for all the other featured articles, which I'm just labeling as kind of like secondary. And then this is really where perhaps it's like really boring to look at, but I think is really cool, which is you can just call cache tag and then put in an array of strings based on whatever you want. And you can see here I'm doing a mix of the actual categories and just kind of some broad strings for if any article list should update this, and just like a article all label in case I just want to blast my cache for everything for some one-off situation. But I need to have the categories in here because if I change which articles are associated to a category, that could change when it gets rendered into this hero section. So this has got some logic in it that is contingent on kind of like my business logic. But what's really nice about this is that I'm running this cache tag call right after I get the content. So I can get the content back, get the data associated to it, the IDs and things, and just tag the ID, not the path, but the ID. So it's really, really easy now for me to just associate this page with the actual entity that is changing instead of trying to do some lookup of the path that I hope I get right and doesn't change in the future without this being updated. So a much more reliable and I think clearer way of doing revalidation. And this extends to basically all the components, taking advantage of caching with cache components. So this is the article detail page, and the code here is very similar. I use cache remote for the max duration that I can. I'm getting my article this time by the slug, and then I'm setting my cache tag to the article ID, its associated category ID, and then the kind of like catch-all tag. So if any of that updates, I can update this too. The revalidation handler does the work of actually doing the on-demand revalidation. So there's some checks here to make sure that like the right party is calling this API, which you definitely want to do to keep it safe. But then otherwise, it's just taking this is on main. I need to be on the contentful branch. So what I need to make sure I do is basically look at the content type. And then if the content type is article, I know that the tags I need to revalidate are this article colon ID. I'm just using that as kind of my naming convention. And likewise for category. So I'm not doing lookups of the path. I'm not trying to figure out which site the user was on. If I have a multi-site or doing multilingual handling, I just pass in the ID. So while this is more complicated than like the previous like non-CMS example, this is, I think, very straightforward compared to revalidation that I've seen in other solutions. So that's the demo slash the example that I wanted to provide. If you want to see this in more detail, we have this repo available. It's open source under the Vercel Partner Solutions org on GitHub. The demo is at the platformpress.vercel.app, and here's the QR code um, for the repository. Oh shoot! I just realized that the code I was showing was not visible to you all. All right, let me really quick see if I can change my screen here so that you can actually see it. Apologies about that. All right, let me go back here. All right, so the example that I had, shoot. So this was, let's see, how far do I have to go back? All right, let me run through it again really quick. So the demo that I had was the platform press. It's this application, this news media site. I already kind of voiced this over, but this is like a mock news website. Pulling content from Contentful, bunch of different pages on here, although it's primarily just a home page, a detail page, and then a search page. What I demonstrated was really how content across the site is commingled, kind of in a bunch of different components. It can be complicated to revalidate an entire path all at once. And you really just want to update the sections of the site, not just like the entire page at a time. So I had updated this category label, which was changelog previously, which you can see is like at the top of this page, as well as like kind of within the latest news, and then at the bottom here. So I updated this label from changelog updates to just, or from changelog to changelog updates in Contentful. I'll do the opposite here. This calls a webhook, as I already mentioned. And then this will just update on the live site as soon as that webhook is called. So you can see pretty quick with the webhook call. But then this is all updated across the site. And what's happening here is like it might look like the entire page is being revalidated, but I'm actually only revalidating the components that need to change. So the components that I showcased were that hero section at the top is using the use cache directive. Use cache remote specifies that you use the Vercel data cache. And then I'm actually able to just set the cache tag after I do the content retrieval. So that content retrieval is this block of code here. So really, really powerful paradigm because weren't really able to do this without use cache before. So you were stuck probably guessing, okay, given this content type, I should probably update these pages, but I don't actually know if the content there needs to change, and I don't need to update everything there. So you can do that really, really easily with use cache, cache tag, and revalidate tag. And then I had showed the article example hit there, but then you can also see that like the revalidation code for this, which is in this revalidate API, it's pretty straightforward. You get the payload from, in this case, Contentful. I just do a check to see if it's either an article or a category, and then I'm just passing really the entity or the entry ID for what should be revalidated because all my tags are ID based. It's not path based or something else. So I think this is very straightforward, particularly compared to what I've seen in the past, as I already kind of mentioned. So bringing this back to where we were in the exam or in the slide deck, if you want to see this code base, we have it open sourced. It's actually kind of written in an agnostic fashion by default. So there is no CMS in the main branch, but if you go to the Contentful branch, you can see the Contentful version of this. But this is the QR code to the GitHub repository. Also happy to take questions on this at the end. I apologize for not catching that the screen was being shared. All right, but let's continue on. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a delay. But that's cache components. Next, let's talk about the other features of Next.js 16 that were announced and released. So we now have Next.js Dev Tools, MCP. So if you're using a coding agent to build applications with Next, this is a great way for it to receive access to your app. This MCP will enable you to have your agent to have error detection in both the build and runtime logs of your application, can run live state queries. So if you're managing state in your app, the agent can be aware of what the state is, as well as inspect your server actions and overall component hierarchy. So it has a really, really clear picture of your application. The development logs for the server and accounts are also available, as well as a set of development tools, which really kind of gives the MCP, superpowers for helping you build. So it's going to have access to the Next.js knowledge base. There's going to be migration and upgrade tools, particularly around cache components. This is going to be really great. So if you want to adopt cache components, which I was just showing, this MCP will be great for facilitating that. And it also has access to the Playwright MCP, so you can actually verify pages in your browser. If you want to enable it, make sure you're on Next.js 16, and then you just have to add the Next Dev Tools MCP to the .mcp.json file. I should note, like I talked about cache components first, but the features here are not necessarily associated with cache components. You can just use these. TurboPack, this is really exciting. TurboPack is now stable, both in development and production. It is now the default bundler for all new Next.js projects. You can expect production builds to be around 2 to 5 times faster. The refresh or fast refresh is also going to be up to 10 times faster. So again, this is already going to be opted for you by default. But if you want to learn more or you're upgrading and you want to take advantage, go ahead and take a look at the docs here. All right, next is middleware is now proxy. Not actually a ton for you to do to adopt this, but the gist here is that the middleware.ts file is now being renamed to proxy.ts. We did this to make it much more explicit that there's a network boundary that exists when you're working with middleware, which we think is really important context to have if you're writing code in there. Proxy.ts will now also run on the Node.js runtime. If you want to continue to take advantage of the Edge runtime, you can still do that. You'll just use the middleware.ts file as it is right now. But just know that this is deprecated and it's going to be removed in a future version. But otherwise, you should the signature here really doesn't change. You can see in this code snippet on the right that it's the function is named proxy. But previously it was middleware. Everything else in there is staying the same. This one really, I'm really excited about this. This has kind of been on my radar for a while. React compiler support is now stable. So this basically gives you access to the React compiler, which is stable, which will automatically memoize components, i.e., help client-side optimizations around re-renders without you having to do any code changes. And I love this. I don't like worrying about memoization. Also, I could be better at it, and React compiler is better than me. So this is a huge thing to just flip on, at least on my projects. This is opt-in, so if you want to use it, go ahead and go to your next config and just flag the React compiler flag to true. And otherwise, make sure that you're running in the latest, or you have the latest version of the compiler installed. There's a lot more. I'm not gonna talk about it all, but we've done a set of other improvements. There's improved logging. TurboPack is going to go continue to iterate and become faster. So there's a beta for file system caching, which is really cool. And then we announced build adapters APIs. If you're trying to run next somewhere else that isn't Vercel, we have that API in alpha. And then there's also enhanced routing. Obviously, now we're using React 19.2. So there's a lot more to read and glean from what we have. So I definitely recommend you check it out if you haven't already. All right. I see I'm having issues with my camera here. I am going to fix that really quick here. Let's just switch to my other one. I'm not having a good uh, tech day. All right. Next, changing gears to Ship AI. I want to talk about some of the main AI features and products that we announced. I'm going to center this mostly around the workflow development kit for Cell Agent and the AI SDK, though there were a lot of other features also announced, so if you want to take a look at the full details, we have a recap blog up at the Vercel blog. But first, I want to talk about the workflow development kit. This is new. It's in beta. It's really, really cool. If you've ever built an agent before, I think you'll understand the benefit that's being provided here. So the workflow development kit is about making it really, really easy to build apps and agents that can maintain state with ease. This is an open source TypeScript framework. And much like other features of Vercel, this is about removing the need to provision infrastructure yourself for things like queues, retries, and persistence. The stance that we have here is that we want these apps to be reliable, durable, and observable by default. We also want you to be able to run this anywhere on any platform. But right now, and for the context of like what I'm going to cover, you can use Workflow Development Kit on Vercel right now via Worlds, which is this kind of like paradigm for cross-platform support. The example that I'm going to walk through just through some code snippets here is this example where maybe you have some work that has to be done by an agent, like hailing a ride. It has to do some work. It has dependencies on third parties. Those things could fail. They may depend on kind of like approval from manual processes. It's hard to build that without standing up the right infrastructure. So to get started, what you need to do is, well, one, you have to use the workflow development kit, but then you use the use workflow directive. And it basically tells this app that it needs to be this reliable kind of like flow of work that has to happen that could be resumed or picked up later as necessary. So here we have this hail ride. We're saying, okay, use workflow. We want to have the workflow development kit applied here for these subsequent functions like validate ride request, assign driver, notify a rider, and create receipt. These are what you'll see are step functions, which are like these reliable units of work where each one of those could pause for a duration of time. If they crash, they can be picked up, and you can see how that could be useful or that can be implemented with this kit. So, if you've met me or talked to me or seen any of my enablements in the last couple of years, you've probably heard me talk about framework defined infrastructure. And that's what's at play here with Workflow Development Kit. So the gist is we just want engineers to implement their workflows that agents can use and just write your logic. And it's not worry about infrastructure. So you'd implement your workflow like this Hail Ride example. You'd implement these step functions as defined via workflow, and then when you deploy it to a world or with Vercel, Vercel is going to use framework defined infrastructure. Just look at your code base for you, and then just infer from that the exact infrastructure that needs to be provisioned, whether it's a queue, a Vercel function, or storage. So you're not needing to go anywhere to stand it up. Vercel takes care of that for you. It's the same paradigm here for workflow. So going a little bit deeper into this example, so I had mentioned that these are step functions. So when you use step, which is another directive, this is defining that this work should really persist the progress so it could retry safely if something happens. Um, when you use step within one of these functions, it's basically creating an isolated API route, or it is creating a isolated API route recording the inputs and outputs. So this makes it observable, but it also makes it really resilient, where it can replay the execution if there's a crash, but also allows us to pause and pick up if there's some other dependency that needs to happen upstream. And again, we're trying to I think this is a really simple API. We just want you to write in the code that you're already using, which is JavaScript and TypeScript. So, one thing that this facilitates, again, with each step function kind of becoming its own isolated API route, is now you can just suspend the work of this workflow without consuming any resources. So you can do things like pausing for minutes to months, and then picking it back up where it left off, and you didn't have a function that you paid for because it was running for 3 months. So this example here is like just use workflow. You can use the sleep function as part of workflow and sleep for a duration, a period, duration of time. In this case, 3 days. And then when it's done, it will pick up and resume. In this case, send a ride credit to that user. So really, really powerful. But then I think the most obvious thing that this maybe facilitates is now you can use workflow to respond or wait for external events and webhooks. So you can use workflow to wait for external data like a payment, a confirmation from another system, or a user action. And it's facilitated by this ability to pause without you consuming and paying for that kind of like idle time there. So in this example, we have this validate payment method that's running. It uses the use workflow directive. We use this create webhook function as part of the SDK. We perform a fetch or we perform a post out to some API to validate something about our flow. It could be a payment. We provide, as part of that post, a body that specifies a webhook. That webhook was created using the Workflow SDK. Because we did that kind of with this SDK, we now have that endpoint available for that system to call when it's ready. And then we just await for that webhook to call, as you can see kind of at line 15 here. So all of this is co-located in one function. It's very clear that this is kind of like the flow that has to happen. I've built agents in my own projects, and I can't tell you how much pain this would have solved for me because I without this would be standing up server actions or backend code somewhere in my code base. It's not going to be likely co-located with the actual webhook that gets called from the service. And that's just frustrating for me both to kind of like build, but also to like keep the context in my head to make it maintainable by other developers. So this creates it all in one place. Really, really nice. I love that this is something that this SDK can do. So this is again open source framework for you to use. You can access the docs and read more at useworkflow.dev. Um, Again, this is I think an awesome tool to deploy to Vercel and test as you see fit. And please reach out if you have any questions or feedback. All right, next is the Vercel agent. So the Vercel agent is um, a set of tools, or it's an agent that provides development tools to help you ship. It works where you work, which is in GitHub on your PRs. And when you have it enabled and you make a PR, it's going to perform automatically a code review. It's going to identify security vulnerabilities. It's going to look for logic errors in your code and suggest also performance issues. It's going to create patches for you too. And it's not going to do like a YOLO patch where it just kind of guesses what the fix should be. It actually uses a sandbox on your build, your change to help make sure that it's the right patch and that it works correctly. And then if you want to use Vercel Agent on the Vercel platform, you can also do that. It can be used to help investigate errors, to debug. It can also correlate kind of like errors in your logs versus issues that you're seeing. It's really, really easy to enable. You just go to the agent tab on Vercel. Pricing is credit based, and if you enable it today, you can get $100 credit. Again, really easy to enable this. Here's a screenshot, but you basically just go to your Vercel team, go to the agent tab, and you'll likely see a modal like this ship faster and safer with Vercel agent, and then you just have to enable, and then you'll get that $100 credit. All right. Next is the AI SDK 6. So AI SDK 6, also in beta, is moving towards like this agent first architecture. And with it comes some new features that I think are really useful. First, there's this the ability now to control when a tool is executed based on a human in the loop approval. So that's what this snippet to the right is. We have this process a payment tool that an agent would have access to. And then if you had a condition where if the payment was over a certain amount, you actually need to have a human approve it. You can just set this needs approval property to true based on the condition that you have, and then it will require that human actually approves it. The snippets were too much for a slide, but in the AI SDK 6 docs, we have an example of what the UI code would look like for that approval. This version also includes an agent abstraction, basically making it really easy to encapsulate custom agents that you have and then reuse them as you see fit without having to, you know, copy a bunch of code all across your code base and create a maintenance nightmare. So that's a nice tool to have, and then also, or a nice interface to have. And then also you can do now structured data output alongside tool calling. On the abstraction note, out of the box in the AI SDK 6, there is a tool loop agent, which is a good example of the abstraction benefit here. So you have access to this agent as kind of like a first class citizen, where you can create agents from it, as you see here, this weather agent. And this tool loop agent by default will loop for a maximum of 20 iterations, trying to get to figure out the answer or get the result needed before it returns, as well as encapsulating some other logic. So I think you can see here, like we have 16 lines of code, and we're using this agent that has kind of like some not I'd say complex logic, but there's some complexity to the logic. And you can build agents like this yourself using this new interface. So, for example, if you wanted to build like an orchestrator agent that delegates work to sub agents, you can implement the agent interface and do exactly that. Then you're just using this orchestrator class across your code base, making things a little bit easier to maintain as well as easy to understand um, with where you use it on your app. Here's a link to the docs. Again, this is in beta, but we're always looking for feedback. So if you have it, please feel free to send it to the team. All right. So we're coming up on the end here. I wanted to take some time, talk about other change log items and releases outside of the conference announcements. These, I think, just based on what I've heard from many of the engineers in the partner community, I think are relevant. Although they might skew to just things that I think are interesting. The first one being bulk redirects are now generally available. One thing that I've seen across our partners is that a lot of you are doing migrations. They're not greenfield applications. And if it's a migration, you probably have redirects. And if it's been around for a really, really long time, you probably have a lot of redirects. So with bulk redirects on Vercel, you can now actually support it now actually supports more than 1 million static URL redirects per project. If you have an enterprise team, you get 10,000 included per project, and then you can pay $50 a month for every additional 25,000 redirects. You can import these directly into Vercel and manage them there. You can import from like a CSV or a JSON. If you want to learn more, this is a link to the changelog, but we also have docs that this links to. Micro front ends are now also generally available. I know this is one that many partners have been asking about for quite a while here. If you're not familiar with micro front ends, the idea here is that if you have a really, really, really large application that's hard to ship changes to because it's just hard to orchestrate sequencing all the work and the build queues, you can now split that application up into very small, independently deployable units. So you can might have just one team that works on one section of the site, and then they can just ship as they want. They don't have to necessarily keep all the context of the rest of the application in mind when they make their changes. Although they should still obviously be aware of what's happening across the application. Vercel handles this natively in a bunch of different ways. Honestly, it's probably worthy of its own webinar to talk about micro front ends. What the gist here is Vercel is making sure that it composes this really, really large application of smaller applications and makes sure that routing is seamless for the end user. So there's not any performance impact because this is a micro front end application. You get 2 micro front end projects included, and then it's priced at 250 per project per month after that. I've been spending a ton of time in observability, optimizing sites, and also leveraging it for the platform press demo that I had. So caching details now being available in runtime logs is just huge. You can go directly to the runtime logs, click on a request that came in, and you can see exactly or see more details, I should say, on what the Vercel CDN is doing for caching this content. It will list, like for instance, the cache key, cache tags, and revalidation reason. So if you're adopting that new pattern that I had showed you earlier, this is a really great feature to have as you're shipping and testing to make sure that that works right. AI chat is now available in the Vercel docs. I prior to this was just using V0 as kind of a proxy to our docs, but now I can just go to the Vercel docs and chat with them and ask the same questions. So really, really easy to do this. Just go to vercel.com/docs. There's an Ask AI button in the top right. If you and then ask away. You can also copy the details of that chat into Markdown, share them, put them to other agents, and get your answers or get your questions answered. We've expanded RBAC controls for enterprise teams. So you can now have multiple roles per user. There's a new security role for security and compliance. You can also add granular capabilities in addition to the team and the project role that you've assigned to a user. And then we've also extended these permissions for managing projects, deployments, and environments. I know probably this is one thing where you probably don't care at all about this, or you care a lot about this. So if you've ever talked to me about RBAC, definitely log into Vercel and see the new enhancements that we've made here. There's probably a lot of features that you've been looking for that are now available. All right, a little bit of a rush given the technical snafus that I've had, but this is the time for me to answer any questions that you may have. Also, I'm leaving contact information up here if there's any other questions after the fact that you'd like to send our way. So I'm at alex.holly at Vercel, and then also leaving the partner.program at vercel.com alias up here too. All right, let's take a look if there's any questions. I don't see any in the chat. That's fine. Um, give folks a couple seconds here in case there are a couple more. All right, if there isn't, then we can call it here. Again, please reach out if there's anything that comes up after the fact. But thanks again for attending this session, and I'll catch you in the next one.